Earlier I spoke to Brendan O'Neill. Now, last time I spoke to Brendan, he is, of course, the editor of Spiked Online in the UK, and he writes for The Spectator. Terrific, very great friend of Sky. He's been out to Australia here. I spoke to him about Boris Johnson and Brexit, and I started off by asking him, mentioning that, of course, the last time he and I spoke, it was whether Boris would actually be Prime Minister. Brendan predicted accurately that he would be. But also, now I asked Brendan about the exciting new vibe that has taken over in Britain since Boris Johnson became Prime Minister. Brendan O'Neill.
Boris has finally fulfilled his destiny, as he no doubt sees it, and become Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And it's caused what can only be described as hysteria among the chattering classes and the PC elite. I mean, I can't remember a meltdown like this since the Brexit vote itself. I mean, they've really gone completely nuts about the fact that Boris is now in Downing Street. And the way they're talking about it, you'd actually think Britain had just been taken over by, you know, genuine Nazis. I mean, they really are unhinged in the way they talk about Boris as this kind of grave threat to Britain and this evil, racist, misogynistic Prime Minister, none of which is true at all. They've completely taken leave of their senses. And in fact, the first week of Boris's government has been very interesting. They've come out fighting. Boris, in particular, has come out fighting in relation to Brexit and in relation to the European Union, and has made it clear to Brussels that we're not willing to have the Irish backstop, which is the worst part of the EU deal on Brexit, which would basically mean that parts of the United Kingdom could be kept in the single market. And he's made it clear that we want to change that, we want to get rid of that, and we want to have a fresh round of negotiations in which British interests take precedence. So everyone needs to ignore the Boris derangement syndrome that's taking place in the UK and recognise that actually his government's got off to a pretty good start.
It was very impressive. He was very Churchillian. Obviously, he's written about Churchill. When he was flaying Jeremy Corbyn there on the floor of Parliament, it was very impressive stuff. How worried are Labour that they don't have the measure of this bloke?
I think they're really worried, and I think the first appearance that Boris made at the dispatch box in Parliament, his first appearance as Prime Minister, he wiped the floor with Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, it was such a humiliating spectacle for the Labour Party. The thing that he did, which was most powerful and which will really have resonated with Labour voters, traditional working-class Labour voters, he really took Corbyn to task for the fact that Corbyn has been a lifelong Eurosceptic. He has been anti-EU all his life. In that sense, he follows in the tradition of great Labour figures like Tony Benn, who all were passionately anti-European Union and anti-EEC. And Corbyn abandoned all of those democratic principles over the past couple of years and has now turned the Labour Party into a Remainer party, into a pro-EU party, into a pro-second referendum party. It is the biggest abandonment of political principle in living memory in this country. It's really astonishing and humiliating for Corbyn. And Boris just dragged him over the coals in relation to that and said, you've abandoned your principles, you were a Eurosceptic and now you're a slavish devotee of Brussels. So all of those things, not only did it provide good viewing for those of us who like to watch what happens in the House of Commons, but also it really signalled that the Boris government intends, I think, to try to tap into traditional working-class Labour voters who feel completely and utterly abandoned by the kind of woke bourgeois machine that the Labour Party has become in recent years.
Now, he had a great line about body snatchers. He used the image of the body snatchers, invasion of the body snatchers, how Jeremy Corbyn had changed. But there's another phrase which is doing the rounds to do with, I think it's the undead zombies within Boris Johnson's own party. So these were the Remainers within the Theresa May cabinet, Brendan, who he would very swiftly clean that lot out and put in some very good people like Jacob Rees-Mogg and others. So how much of a threat are those Remainers? Is there a threat of civil war yet to come within the Conservative Party, or are they just going to sit back and hope Boris can get them out of Brexit and win the election?
I think there is a huge risk of civil war in the Tory party, and I think Remainers, Remoaners, that section of the political class which is deeply, profoundly anti-Brexit and, in my view, anti-democratic. They are a complete and utter menace to democracy. They are a menace to freedom. They are a menace to the millions upon millions of people who voted in good faith to leave the European Union. I mean, it's really astonishing. It's quite difficult to explain to people outside of the UK just how much of a war on democracy we are currently living through. For the past 3+ years, various sections of the establishment, the majority of the establishment, in fact, have declared open war on the democratic mandate, on the 17 million strong vote for Brexit. They're using every single trick in the book to try to make sure that it doesn't happen. And, you know, lots of people, including people in Boris's own government, are saying that if we don't make Brexit happen, then it could be the end of the Tory party as we know it, because everyone will abandon us. But it's far more profound than that. I would say that if they don't make Brexit happen, it's the end of democracy as we know it. Wow. And Britain's claim to be a democratic nation will be massively called into question if the largest democratic vote in the history of this country is not pushed through. So I think that's really what is at stake. And I think some people in Boris's government understand that. I wish more of them did, because then we might have a chance of saving democracy in this country.
Now, Nigel Farage, obviously, what's the ground now? Nigel Farage kind of rode in on his white horse a few months ago. In fact, when he was out in Australia, he announced that he was getting back in the saddle and taking the charge up because he was so dismayed about Theresa May's lies and complete incompetence. So we saw the surge for the Brexit Party and Nigel Farage. Does, you know, how does your good, honest Brexiteer choose? Do they go for Boris if there's a general election, or do they go for Farage? And do you think Boris will wait to call the general election until after he has delivered Brexit?
That's the million-dollar question. My instinct right now is that Boris will try to push through his version of Brexit, which could well be a no-deal Brexit. I don't think it will successfully go through Parliament, because Parliament is absolutely ram-packed with anti-democrats and Remoaners. And I think it might be at that point that he calls a general election to try and get a public democratic mandate for finally leaving the European Union, even though we've given that democratic mandate many times over the past few years. But I think the way in which it's going to pan out will be really interesting. And the question of Farage versus Boris is one of the most interesting clashes at the moment right now. And the way I see it is that the Brexit Party has already had a very positive impact on British politics. As you say, they completely cleaned up at the EU elections in May. They won more than 5 million votes. They were the winning party. And that managed to put huge pressure on the Boris camp and on the Tory party to realise that they really have to get serious about Brexit, or the Brexit Party will be breathing down their neck. So when it comes to a general election, my view will be whichever of these two parties is offering the most serious version of Brexit is the one that Democrats ought to support.
And do you think we could end up with, instead of David Cameron and Nick Clegg, could we end up with Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage after an election in some kind of coalition or joint leadership of that whole movement?
I mean, that is a distinct possibility. If Boris didn't get enough to form a majority and the Brexit Party did well, and the polls predict they will do well, it is very possible that that will happen. I think there's a bit of bad blood between Boris and Farage, and I do think they have different views of what Brexit means. And, you know, for example, Nigel Farage and the Brexit Party don't just want to get Brexit over the line. They also, as their slogan says, they want to change politics for good. So they want to shake up every facet of British politics, from the civil service to the House of Lords and all the other kind of anti-democratic layers that currently exist. So they do have a more radical take. Whether that will marry up very well with Boris's slightly more conservative take, we have to wait and see. But the big question still remains, as it has been for 3 years and probably will be for the next 3 years: when are we going to get the thing we voted for? And that is what millions of people are rather impatiently asking.
Now, Brendan, just before we go, a lovely article you've written in the Spectator Coffee House today, and of course people can read you on your own Spiked Online, which is a fantastic read always. You've written about this interesting situation we're where a woman in a niqab was abusing a gay pride march.
Shame on you! Shame on you! Shame on all of you! Shame on you!
So you had classic homophobia coming from a woman in a niqab. Tell us this story. It's extraordinary.
It's really an extraordinary video clip that has now gone viral of this woman covered from head to toe in this medieval black cloth, screaming at a pride marcher, saying, "Shame on you, you people are despicable," and as you say, God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. Really bizarre spectacle, and it's really thrown the woke left into disarray. They don't know which way to turn because, of course, they're very pro-pride and pro-gay, but they also think it's a tantamount to a speech crime to criticise anyone who wears the niqab or to criticise Islam in general. So they're really torn over this, and I've noticed they've been far softer on this woman than they would normally be on homophobes, which suggests that their determination never to raise a critical point about Islam has really reached pathological levels. And the argument I would make is that Islam, like every other ideology and religion and creed, needs to be as open to frank criticism and mick-taking and ridicule as everything else. And that's the message I would take. If we really want to challenge these backward views that this woman was spouting, we have to subject her faith to public ridicule.
Absolutely. And Brendan O'Neill could chat for hours. No one does mick-taking better than you do, and you certainly keep a great eye on the madness of identity politics in the UK. Always great to talk to you. Thanks so much, Brendan O'Neill.